This is Special Session. I'm Brian Schott with Utah Political Watch. Utah's first congressional district Democratic primary is shaping up to be one of the most interesting races on the June ballot. And today I'm talking with one of the candidates trying to make sense of a crowded progressive lane. Utah State Senator Nate Blouin is running on a pretty straightforward argument that the Democratic Party needs to stop negotiating against itself before it even gets to the table. We talk about the three-way progressive split in the race, his pledge to drop out if a poll shows he's not the frontrunner among the progressive candidates, the Stratos data center fight that's become a flashpoint across the state, and what it would actually take to win a general election in a district where registered Democrats are outnumbered by both independents and Republicans. If you want to keep up with what's happening in Utah politics, hit subscribe so you don't miss our coverage of the CD1 race and everything else on the ballot this June. And if you want to support our work, sign up for the Utah Political Watch newsletter at utahpolitics.news. We're independent, reader-funded, and we answer to nobody but you. Senator Blouin, good to see you this afternoon. Thank you for taking the time.
Always a pleasure, Brian. Thanks.
Easy question to start off with, and I think I've asked you this before, but let's go over it again. Why you? Why now?
I am running because this election is really about taking on the rigged system that has worked against so many working people, against average families in our communities. I have fought against those same interests that are really dragging people through the mud these days, against the big corporate landlords, against the oil and gas industry here in Utah, against folks who are really too in step with the establishment that we see contributing to campaigns. And so I am focused on making things work better for average people by getting big money out of politics, by addressing things like gerrymandering and making sure that we actually have a system that represents average people rather than big donors. And that's the track record that I've got in the state Senate. And that's the message that I'm sending to people, because I don't think anyone else in this race has an actual track record of standing up and challenging the structures of power that are frankly supporting other people in this campaign.
This race is being characterized as, in broad strokes, a contest between progressives and moderates, progressives and centrists. How do you see this race? Is that an accurate depiction, or do you see it as something else?
I think it is. I also look at it as more about top versus bottom, and who's focused on the economy, whether that's the economy and how it works for big corporations or the economy and how it works for normal people who are struggling. I am in it for the people that are struggling. And that's who I've given a voice to in the state Senate. I've, not been fond. The lobbyists here in Utah have not been fond of me for quite some time, because I am going to stand up and speak truth to power and say things that go against their interests. And so I think that's kind of how I look at this is top versus bottom, left versus right still for sure, left versus center for sure to some extent. But I think there's also that aspect of like, who is really in touch with our economy, with our communities, with our schools, with healthcare, all those things that people are struggling with right now that we should be supplementing with more resources rather than continuing to grant tax loopholes and continuing to allow these big companies to profit off of the backs of working people.
Okay, let's put a pin in all of that for a second. I want to get back to it. But so far, pretty much the big headline in this race was the convention results, where Liban Mohammed surprised everyone, ended up winning the vote at convention, getting 51% of the final vote. What is your reading of that result? What does that result say about this race?
I think for one thing, it said that people were frustrated with the moderate, center of Ben McAdams, and he, lost by a hair. On the other side, I think it said that, Liban only won by a couple of percent and wasn't able to pull together a massive coalition there. My old Reddit posts from 15 years ago come out because there are people who would rather have voters focus on those old posts rather than the actual interest that people are feeling. And that cut into the momentum that we had. And so I think we've seen that rebound. I mean, we've seen people come back together and really support this campaign. Some people double down on things. And I haven't seen anyone else able to leverage that sort of momentum. We've continued to pick up steam with issues that became even more relevant, really falling into my wheelhouse on things like this massive, ridiculous data center in Box Elder County. And so we've leveraged that and just continued to roll forward and pick back up that momentum. And I think it's been exciting to see that we have withstood that sort of pressure from the establishment who came after us because they were getting scared about actually having a challenge in this race.
So we're recording this on Tuesday, and you announced earlier today that you're going to be launching a poll of the first congressional district to see which one of the three progressive candidates in the race, you, Liban Mohammed, or Michael Farrell, which one is polling the best. And then you made the claim that you would drop out of the race if you're not the frontrunner to try to consolidate the vote. Now, since I'm a hardened cynic, so I look at these things and that's the lens with which I look at these things. So I'm curious. You're a sitting state senator. You've got arguably the highest baseline name recognition. So isn't this just kind of already weighted in your favor? And it just feels to me like this might just be a data-driven way or a lever to try and push some of the other rivals out of the race.
Yeah, I mean, we had conversations going back literally months about this. I mean, I've spoken with other candidates about trying to preserve the progressive solidarity and come together and figure out who can best win this race. And those were kind of rebuffed after the Reddit post came out. I had a very serious conversation, both introspectively and with the team about what moving forward looked like. And everyone basically said, like, there is no one else in the race. There's no other campaign that has been built to withstand this sort of heat, to be able to beat McAdams, to be able to take all of the outside spending that they're going to throw at us. And so we move forward. And now we come into this situation where we've got three progressives, at least in name, on the ballot. And they will all be on the ballot. It's too late to remove a name at this point. And so we waited as long as we could. I mean, we had these conversations a couple of weeks ago, tried to get other candidates involved to say, what sort of methodology is going to be used? Can we split the costs? All those things. And no one else was willing to come to the table. And we have the resources to do it. And so we decided we're gonna go ahead, and ballots go out next Tuesday. People deserve to have a full picture of this race before then. And if they want to see a progressive win or if they want to see the establishment win, that's a choice that they're going to have to figure out. And I think it's going to be easier if there's some data behind it. And that's why we took this strategy, because I don't think there's another good way to address it. I think if you looked at the subjective pieces of this, right, of we've got Bernie Sanders endorsement, Congressional Progressive Caucus, leaders we deserve, sitting state senator, raise more money, have more donors, knock more doors. All those, all those pieces of data would point this in my favor. So it would be pretty easy for me to say everyone else should drop out and get behind my campaign. I am not saying that. I am saying if you have built a strong enough campaign to win on June 23rd, that needs to have been built already, because you can't build the airplane as it's flying at this point. It's time to put it to work. And that's what we're trying to say here is we want to beat Ben McAdams. That's been my entire perspective on this race. Is it is about having someone who really represents this very blue district. And we should have one choice there rather than splitting up the vote like we've seen in other states.
Just to play the devil's advocate here, if the goal of this is to stop a moderate like Ben McAdams from getting elected, couldn't someone just say, why didn't you throw your support behind Liban Mohammed when he won the vote at convention? Because I'm curious what your argument is, why a poll commissioned by your campaign, why would that be a more valid metric of progressive strength, the strength of the progressive candidates, than what happened at convention? Can you explain that for me?
Sure. I mean, we gathered 7,000 signatures to get on the ballot. We spent about $15,000 to do that, which is a small fraction of what Liban and other campaigns spent because we had the volunteer base to do it. We still have that volunteer base. We're on the ballot that way. I actually said at one point when asked that I basically would not drop out if I was on the when I got on the ballot, because we felt like we built the strongest campaign earlier. Now I'm changing that because I think my whole goal here is to see the progressive movement succeed. Convention is a very small, it's a small swath of the electorate. You can I don't know if manipulate is the right word. It's not manipulation, but it is, stacking the deck in certain ways. And, we certainly saw some of that happen. And so I think that's how I would read that situation. And just the timing and the momentum that was there had changed the picture momentarily. But it was not put to good use. I don't think there was not like an immediate, like, massive launch of a huge movement to support another candidate. It was just a lot of questions. And I think we answered those questions. And now here we are, is still the strongest campaign in this race.
I think that's a fair answer. I want to go back to something we talked about a little bit earlier. Your record on the Hill, and a constant criticism of you has been that you've been unable to pass a single piece of legislation since you've been in the legislature. And I was trying to think of a way to talk about this, or to ask you a question that was not, just that fact, which is the result of many factors. One, you've got the Republican supermajority, and nothing passes unless they want it to pass. And also, a lot of the policy proposals that you put forward just don't, the GOP supermajority, they just don't vibe with. So I'm curious, in order. If you are elected, it's likely that there will be a Democratic majority in the House of Representatives in Washington, and that will be a much different dynamic than what you're used to. But you're still going to have to work with not only progressives, but you're going to have to work with moderate Democrats in order to get policy proposals. And you may even have to build a coalition with people across the aisle for these massive campaign promises or massive things that you want to do, like Medicare for all. That's going to require a broad coalition in order to get that sort of thing passed. What in your record says that you're able to do that? Because, if you just look at it at face value, there's not a lot of experience that you've done that. There's not a track record that you've done that. So how do you plan to do that? How do you plan to work with is going to be a large group of lawmakers who come from different backgrounds, and they've all got their own districts to worry about. So I'm curious how you're going to approach that and how you plan to get that done.
Yeah, I think you raised a couple good points there. First of all, it's a very different dynamic in DC, and we, should have the majority this year. And I think the initial approach will be putting forward the big, bold legislation that we want to see passed when we have hopefully a Senate majority, which, is 50-50 maybe this year. And of course, a presidency that would support that stuff. And so I think it's about putting those bills out there of saying, this is what we want to move forward with when we have the ability to pass legislation. I've got the support of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, which is somewhere in the ballpark of 100 members of Congress right there, ready to work. I was looking forward to working with someone like Thomas Massie on some of these campaign finance, these foreign policy issues. Unfortunately, the same people who were backing Ben McAdams' campaign just made sure that he lost re-election. And so that's too bad that we can't find agreement with people that actually have principles. And I think that's another piece of this, is that I've always stood by my principles. I think we need to put these big, bold pieces of legislation forward and then negotiate from there. Ben McAdams wants to negotiate from a place of compromise and weakness. I think when you put forward these proposals that are half-baked, that aren't actually getting at the root causes even to begin with, you're not going to end up with a good result. And so I would say, to have a dynamic in Congress of actually being able to support some progressive and left-leaning legislation that's going to help communities, let's do that from a place where we start with the thing that actually needs to happen and negotiate from there, rather than starting from a place that's like negotiated to begin with, I would say. And so that's where I see some big differences. I've got a great coalition built on this campaign. I'm excited about the people we have supporting us, and look forward to working with them to put forward their proposals and their needs in DC. I mean, these, include legislators, members of Congress, labor unions, mayors, city council members, county council members, the whole gamut. And they've supported our campaign through and through. And I look forward to representing along with those folks in DC.
Back to your experience in the Utah State Legislature, did you try to build coalitions with Republicans? Did you try to work with them? And if so, where were the stumbling blocks, and what did you learn from that?
So another piece I should touch on in regards to the last question, but also ties in here, is a couple pieces of legislation that I authored actually did end up making it into law. People seem to ignore that when they talk about their own successes of passing legislation that didn't actually get passed in their name. A bill on grid enhancing technologies, which I think is a great piece of legislation that helps support a cleaner, more efficient energy grid. A piece of legislation that allows cities to get more water to Great Salt Lake. Those were bills that I ran that passed through the Senate. I think either both unanimously or one was unanimous and the other was pretty well accepted as well, and made it across. And then the House just decided they didn't want to take it up because it had my name on it. And I think that's unfortunate when you see all of those people putting personalities over actual policy. I've never done that. I've voted for legislation from people I vehemently disagree with and think are acting in bad faith much of the time. But if they put forward a good bill, I'll vote for it. I've done that. I've got that track record. And that's unfortunate that Democrats in Utah don't get that same benefit. And I think we should communicate that to more people. So that's been a piece of my whole mindset, is we need to communicate the dynamic here. We need to change the narrative. We need to stop acting like we just need to play along. And that does turn some people off. And, I think from my very first week in the state Senate, when I stood up on the floor and spoke out very strongly against a bill, against now Representative Kennedy's bill banning gender affirming care for minors, that my intern that very year had used just in the recent past. I remember conversations had right after that it was pretty clear they didn't have an appetite for that. And so I think it's unfortunate that was something that, hindered me for the entire time. But it also allowed me to kind of open up and use the platform in a different way than we've seen anyone else do. And I don't mind having that target on my back. I feel like it's been important to have that voice, and to have someone who is going to speak out against, the prevailing tide, whether that's coming from the Democrats or the Republicans.
Let's talk about what has turned into a massive issue, not only in this race, but in primary elections across the state. And that's the gigantic Stratos data center project up in Box Elder County. Over the weekend, hundreds of Utahns, including yourself, were up at the state capitol demanding a halt to this project, called it an existential threat to the Great Salt Lake watershed. But on the other hand, developers and Governor Spencer Cox claim that this project will use, they're calling it a closed loop cooling system with no continuous water draw. As a legislator who is focused deeply on issues surrounding the Great Salt Lake, do you accept the state's net zero water assurances, or do you think that this is something that we just have to have an immediate moratorium on the development of these centers?
I've called for a moratorium nationally. I was half excited and half frustrated to see what Iron County just did, which is a moratorium on data centers, but also on solar projects, which is kind of ironic that they want to put a block on data consuming energy centers, but also, clean energy production. So anyway, that was just a fun aside I just saw. But I think, and on the data center side, that's the right thing, is we need to take a step back. We need to figure out where these things can be located to support our needs. And that is not in states with impaired air sheds and droughts like Utah. I also want to make sure we're not just like creating a race to the bottom and pushing these things into communities like we've seen devastated by diesel and natural gas generators powering Twitter, XAI, whatever in Tennessee. And so I think it's important we have this as a nationwide conversation. And I mean, this data center project in Utah is just incredible. And I say that in a not a good way. I am incredulous at what I am seeing, because it is so massive. It is such a gigantic amount of new emissions. It will pollute our airshed as the EPA is gutting regulations and making Utah look better than it actually is, because they've just lowered the standards, and the state has played along into that as well. So to give these tax benefits away to Kevin O'Leary, to do all of this behind closed doors through MIDA, is an organization, an agency that I've opposed on several instances in the legislature, because I think it is potentially unconstitutional, but also just not the right way to be doing things. And so that the whole process, the whole development is indicative of just a much larger need to stop pandering to people like Kevin O'Leary, a wannabe billionaire who's coming into our community to try to extract resources. We need to figure out what that actually looks like and how or whether we want to move forward with this technology, because the technology itself it's largely surveillance. I mean, it's going to be used to spy on us and that sort of stuff. And so I'm not real interested in seeing that move forward without guidelines on what we're actually using it for. If it's for developing new medicines, great. Let's figure out how to do that in a way that doesn't also pollute our environment and raise the need for even more new medicines and treatments, right? Like there's so many pieces to this. And so that's why I think a moratorium, to pause, to think through this, to think through how we designate areas like Utah as not acceptable for those sorts of things is the right path forward.
You mentioned it. A lot of this project was fast tracked through MIDA. That's a group that can effectively strip away a lot of traditional municipal oversight and access by the public to approve these sorts of things. If you're elected to Congress, what would be your do you think that you would have a role to play to push back against federal or state level land authorities overriding local community consent? I'm curious about your thoughts on that.
In my mind, so we hear a lot of talk about permitting reform at the federal level. And, as a big clean energy advocate who wants to see us transition away from fossil fuels, while at the same time not just building new energy to serve data centers, because that's destructive as well, we do need permitting reform. And to me, that looks like better oversight. That means staffing up agencies like the EPA to actually process permits and hopefully deny permits that don't meet our standards for things like the air and water pollution created by the Stratos proposal. When I hear about just gutting regulations as permitting reform, I think that's ridiculous. And you're seeing why that is not the right answer here. You saw the EPA recently. I think there was comment yesterday with decisions coming soon about allowing big projects like this to actually move forward with construction before they have secured air quality permits. And we need to roll stuff like that back to ensure that there's proper oversight. I think just the platform of being a member of Congress and frankly, objecting to a large amount of what I see happening in the state, of what I see the rest of the delegation doing, I would use that platform to push back and to expose things like MIDA and the decisions that have gotten made there, and the corruption of people like Stuart Adams, who are benefiting from hundreds of thousands of dollars in campaign contributions as a result of this thing, and others as well. That I think Mike Schultz has said he doesn't really support this either, but I think he's talking out of both sides of his mouth because he's at least a savvy politician and sees how strongly the public has come out against this.
Given the boundaries of this newly redrawn first congressional district, what political issues or needs do you think that the previous map that split Salt Lake County into four pieces, what were some of those issues that were being ignored that will now have a chance to be addressed, given the fact that Salt Lake County now remains mostly whole under this map?
I mean, that's a great question. To me, it's Great Salt Lake largely because I've heard in my time in the legislature from rural representatives that, all of this focus shouldn't be on the Great Salt Lake, that, we're not focusing on rural communities enough. And we know they are overrepresented both in the special interests that lobby at the legislature and in the representatives who serve at the legislature. And so having someone in DC with an actual position of power that is very focused on the needs of Salt Lake County, of these communities that are some of the more diverse in the state, that are much different than what we have seen elsewhere. But the Great Salt Lake is one I hear so constantly about because I don't think you see the political will from the Republicans here in Utah to actually move this forward. You see them responding to, and here's the tie into the question, is the agricultural industry. And when you have four districts that all take in large parts of the state's agricultural industry, outside of Salt Lake County, outside of the Wasatch Front, they are very reticent to move forward with anything that would, potentially go after alfalfa. I went as strong as saying the other day with the Deseret News that I think we should be considering eminent domain when it comes to water rights here in Utah. That's maybe not the absolute first thing to look at, but if it comes down to it, and these incentives that we're proposing, the billion from Trump, whoever else, however much money comes down, if you don't force someone to take it up at some point, if they're not willing to themselves, you've got to go forward with something that coerces them into it. And I think that is the place that government needs to step in and protect the interests of the couple million people directly downwind of Great Salt Lake and the catastrophe that's happening. rather than the very small fraction of our economy that comes from alfalfa specifically.
I'm sure that you've seen me say this, but I've looked at the voter data for the newly redrawn first congressional district, the voter registration numbers, and Democrats only make up about a quarter of the electorate in this new district. Independent voters are the largest single bloc; they're about 35%, according to the most recent update that I've seen. Registered Republicans are at about 33.5, 34%. Given that math, how does your progressive platform that includes Medicare for all, cutting off aid for Israel, abolishing ICE, how does that win a general election coalition with independents and moderate Republicans who, frankly, whoever the Democratic nominee is going to need in order to win in November? I'm curious how you're going to message that.
I think there's a couple pieces there. So first, we still see a chunk of Republicans and independents are actually Democrats that will vote in a Democratic primary, and then have registered in that registered as Republicans particularly to vote in those primaries. It's I don't know what percent it is. It's probably single digits, but it's there. I think more than anything, there's also, like I said earlier, it's not necessarily left versus center versus right. It's top versus bottom, and frankly, the amount of I used to be uncomfortable like having this conversation, but America first. I've heard so many people right now on the left, in the middle, whatever, talking about America first in a very different way, which is when it comes to these foreign wars, when it comes to genocide in Gaza, when it comes to Iran, when it comes to Venezuela, reinvesting in our communities rather than continuing these excursions around the world that cost us billions of dollars every single day. And I mentioned Thomas Massey earlier. Even Mitt Romney is talking about taxing the billionaires for heaven's sake. So I think there's appetite there, and it's a matter of like convincing people that we are focused on material conditions that we are seeing in our communities, the actual needs of people being met, of funding our schools, of putting food on the table, of making sure that the balance of taxes is fair, so that most people are, I think most people are paying their fair share. It's just people making, $500,000 a year or more that should be paying more. Let's bring people in along those lines, because I think the vast majority of people will benefit. And I'm sad that the Democratic Party hasn't had better messengers that are willing to go out and tell those stories. You've seen issues like immigration in particular, I think, where Trump started off so strong, and Democrats were like, oh, we can't talk about that. We have to like play along, and we have to talk about border security and all this stuff. And you had, some brave people. I think it was Senator Van Hollen went down to, was it El Salvador or something, and started changing the conversation and telling the story that like these people are being punished and dehumanized and propagandized. And just a couple months later, you saw Trump go underwater on immigration. And now people are recognizing that actually what that is an intrusion on our rights as Americans, as people that are here in our communities, and providing important services and our neighbors. And so I think there are so many ways to talk about these things that reframe them a little bit, that put the real stuff that matters to most people first. And then, we'll get them on board, and we can talk about the other stuff later on when we find agreement elsewhere.
State Senator Nate Blouin, where can people find you online? Your chance to plug all your stuff.
Yeah, thank you. That's always appreciated. NateForUtah.com, NateForUtah.com, at Nate for Utah on most of the social media channels. I'm active on there, so come find me. Always happy to engage, answer questions. We have all sorts of fun volunteer events going on. We're going to be doing a bike ride across the district this Saturday, the 30th. Stop by and join. If you can go to our website, it'll be up on the page and all that. So we would love to have as many people who can get engaged as possible.
Right. Nate, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Brian.